Rest in power, Aretha Franklin. Joining us now is Eric Levitz. He's a politics writer for New York Magazine. Eric, thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Pleasure as always. Eric, you have a piece. We're going to get to a piece that I believe is just going up within minutes, if not already up, on the conundrum of the Nordic countries for the right in this country. But first, let's look at this new White House plan to ask judges, to ask the Supreme Court to scrap Obamacare's consumer protections in September. You know, just to frame this, I mean, obviously, you know, Judge Kavanaugh will be a major blow for, you know, the non-ultra wealthy in this country across the board. And the midterms could very, for all of the things going on with Trump and, you know, and race and corruption and all of these major issues, it could be looked on really simply as a referendum on, you know, any type of attempt to preserve Obamacare, let alone move forward to, you know, a better position, a system like national health care. So what are they doing here? What are they specifically asking? And what are the consequences for what remains of the Obamacare markets? And what could a Democratic Congress do, if anything?
Sure. Yeah, well, so basically a bunch of red states, you know, if you're a red state attorney general, what you do is try to find spurious reasons to kill Obamacare legally. And the fact that none of their previous attempts have worked has not sort of reduced the motivation to do that. So a bunch of red states got together and decided that because Republicans repealed the individual mandate in Obamacare, that means that they can't, you know, they promised insurance companies that they would force everybody to buy insurance, and in exchange, the insurers would not discriminate against people who have a history of mental illness or, you know, other pre-existing conditions. And they're saying, well, you got rid of the mandate, but you're still making them do that stuff, and that's unconstitutional, or that, you know, is a violation of the law. These two parts of the law are not severable from each other. So if the individual mandate is no longer standing, then the judiciary must strike down protections for people with pre-existing conditions. This argument is you know, sort of even more absurd than the previous arguments that conservatives have made legally against Obamacare. Even I think the National Review wrote a negative opinion of the argument. But nonetheless, you know, the Trump administration, which normally the federal government has like a duty that if any legally sustainable argument can be made in defense of a existing federal law, that the Justice Department is incumbent on them to argue for it. Mm-hmm. But Jeff Sessions said that he could not find any argument against this red state case, and therefore was not going to contest it. And is it possible that the right-wing judges, you know, on the appeals court and on the Supreme Court will be so craven as to accept this? It's possible, but really it seems more like just a political own goal for the Republican Party and for the Trump administration, which, you know, the Democratic Party's number one goal, both in the fight over Kavanaugh and in the midterm elections, is to increase the salience of healthcare policy and remind voters about that time that congressional Republicans tried to, you know, throw 22 million people off their health insurance, which was the single most unpopular thing the Republican Party has done since Trump took office, tanked both his approval rating and the Republican standing in the generic ballot when Paul Ryan introduced that bill in the House, and remains in polls. By far, voters preferred the Democrats on the issue of health care by double digits. So their entire goal was to make sure that this was still an issue heading into November. And the Trump administration, by backing not only a challenge to Obamacare, but a challenge to the most popular part of Obamacare. Protections for pre-existing conditions are so popular that actually when Republicans, even in their Obamacare appeal bill, which would have done a lot of horrific things, throwing people off Medicaid, and a bunch of cutting federal health care spending, they still preserved a version of protections for pre-existing conditions because even Paul Ryan wasn't willing to take the heat that was generating.
So is this just an example of the sort of, because on the other hand, okay, so Democrats want to drive turnout based on how unpopular Republican healthcare policies are, and there's going to be no normal person, you know, obviously no Democratic voter, no Democratic leaning voter. There's going to be no of whatever, you know, minuscule amount, whatever handful of people who might be sort of, you know, all over the place voters, swing voters, are going to like Republican proposals to, you know, hand over people's, you know, well-being to HMOs, or you know, destroy federal health spending. This stuff is categorically massively unpopular. On the other hand, obviously Republicans are in a place where it is just even more so about getting the real crazies, the real diehards. I mean, this is why Bannon's back. He's getting funding for some type of new documentary, Trump at war. And this is the type of people that, you know, they're not even the sort of old, you know, like the split that someone like Thomas Frank might have identified. Like, these people might have, you know, arch reactionary social views, but they also might understand, obviously, that Republican policies with regards to government spending and the economy are, you know, bad for you unless you're, a millionaire. The Trump Republican base now does seem, you know, they're the type of people who, you know, Alex Jones said protection for pre-existing, you know, conditions will make your kid transgender or something. So therefore I have to vote because of the Muslim Brotherhood. So is there a rhyme, or is that potentially part of what's going on? Is that, yes, in the broad landscape of sentient humans, reminding people of an attempt to, you know, literally cut people's lifespans, 20 million people's lifespans, and make it so that you can't get health care if you've ever dealt with a medical issue, is not popular. But for the true nutcases that need to turn out, this is just another, you know, battle against Obama's Al-Qaeda plot or something.
Yeah, I don't think there's a political calculus here. I think this is all ideological. I think Jeff Sessions didn't want to sully himself by defending Barack Obama's health care law in court. The people who actually are so geared into Republican politics that they are passionate about, getting their, nephew who has, bipolar disorder, making them unable to be able to afford health care, those people are already going to turn out. I mean, that's the diehard Republican base.
Right.
And Republicans don't want to talk about this issue. If you're looking at their ads, they don't mention health care at all, to the extent that they have. You saw in the special election last week in Ohio, Troy Balderson, the Republican candidate, accused his Democratic rival totally mendaciously of supporting cuts to Medicare. They do not want to campaign as the party that wants to eliminate government benefits for health care. That's not what they want.
Right. So basically, Jeff Sessions, and one could comfortably speculate that there's any number of it would be one thing to defend a law that Bill Clinton did, but Barack Obama, I mean, I think, yeah, right. We all know who Jeff Sessions is. Okay, so you have a piece that I actually don't know if it's been posted yet. We're hot off of the presses with it, dealing with how the American right talks about and understands Nordic countries. There's this notion that it's a conflict on the left. I think that there's interesting and worthwhile debates between, a democratic socialist and social democratic position on the left that deals with the Nordic countries. There's obviously a critique and a debate around, diversity and homogeneity and universal programs that implicates the Scandinavian countries. And some of these conversations are worthwhile and interesting. Sometimes they're disingenuous. But on the right, you've identified this incredible, almost like schizophrenic split in how they're understanding the Nordics. What is that split?
Yeah, well, basically, there's one part of the conservative, one set of conservative intellectuals who is still doing the sort of old-time religion of, any major government program is it's a step on the road to serfdom. It's, you can't have free health care without, leading to jailing political prisoners or something, and basically describing the Nordic countries as, a totalitarian nightmare, not distinguishing it from Venezuela, which is itself not quite a totalitarian nightmare, but obviously a less desirable model, and not distinguish it from, Stalinist Russia. And then on the other hand, there's this more libertarian inclined part of the movement that has discovered that actually, the Heritage Foundation and Cato and these other right-wing think tanks have these weird freedom indexes where they take a bunch of different economic indicators and score how free your country is, and remarkably, sort of bizarrely, their indicators list Denmark as being more capitalist than the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're saying oh no, the left is wrong. Actually, the Nordic countries aren't democratic socialist or social democratic. They aren't totalitarian. They're free market capitalist, and that's why they've been so successful. And both these responses basically reflect just the intellectual bankruptcy of the right on economic issues. Basically, the American people do not think that, an ideal economic policy is one that minimizes the tax burden borne by wealthy individuals and corporate America's labor costs, which is what the right wing is committed to. Most people say, do I want low tax rates on the rich, or do I want a low poverty rate? Well, I would for poor children. I want the latter. And the right has always relied on the idea that, the first order effects of our agenda aren't popular. Yeah, I know you might not like, weak bargaining power for workers and low taxes on the rich and, no significant benefits for your family. You don't get free child care like they get over there. But this system produces higher levels of economic growth and higher levels of innovation, and you know what? It's going to be worthwhile in the end. The rising tide lifts all boats. Mm-hmm. And the Nordics, they're the most socialistic countries in Europe, and they're also host growth rates comparable to the United States, and they also produce, more patents that are acknowledged, that are registered in multiple countries. This is, that they gave birth to Kazaa, they really advanced in driverless cars. So they're innovative, they're high growth, and they also have cradle-to-grave welfare, like an 80% unionization rate. And so the right is left in this position of, they desperately want to be able to, where's the Soviet Union when you need it? They need a boogeyman, and they're left sort of stammering and not sure what to do about the fact that the social democratic model, which has its own problems, but nonetheless, relative to the American model, is working so much better.
No doubt. So before, what are some examples we'll talk about this synthesis that the Nordic countries have that provides the best of both worlds relative to the United States, but what kind of policies make them rank highly on a freedom index? What are those, what kind of policies are we talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little strange. I think a lot of it is basically they're very pro-free trade, which makes sense because these are tiny, cold little countries that, if they're going to have competitive firms, they need to sell to the world. They don't have a large enough domestic market,
right,
and they don't have enough natural resources to not need to import. So they're very pro-free trade, by necessity. So there's that. There's also, this is an incredible concession in this Cato Institute report on Denmark, which is like trying to, galaxy brain liberals that actually know Denmark is pretty capitalist. It says if you put the welfare state aside, everything else, that they do, they have, no minimum wage, which they have no minimum wage because it's unnecessary because everyone's in a union and everyone's wage is pretty high. But nonetheless, they have no minimum wage. And, they have, I guess maybe like they have like less occupational licensing or something. But they say that Denmark is, according to a certain index, the least corrupt government on planet Earth, which is just a remarkable concession. Like even by their logic, which ignores a lot of aspects of the way that the Nordic countries are actually pretty darn socialist. Even if you stipulate that like the only socialist thing about them is a giant welfare state that guarantees like 6 weeks of vacation to like every citizen like each year and yada yada yada. The right's whole argument is that the big government is inherently corrupt, that the government that governs best governs least. And now you're saying as a libertarian think tank that actually the government that governs best is the one that governs most, that one of the largest, most ambitious public sectors in the world is also the cleanest. That's a remarkable concession for the right to make, and it's bizarre that it reflects their desperation that they're actually stumbling on that.
Yeah. So basically, what it seems to me is that you're describing. I mean, first of all, okay, there's totally disingenuous things like minimum wage isn't on the book because it's a unionized society, so therefore workers are just better off, period. And not only do they have union protections, there's more, a kind of cooperative decision-making between government and the unions and the private sector. And there's much more of a kind of sense of like, cohesive strategy so that, firm planning includes things like increasing wages and a broader distribution of the benefits is sort of pre-baked into the system and the power structure, which is obviously antithetical to all of the libertarian and neoliberal extremism that is obviously a product of the right in the United States, but also the center and many people identify on the center left. And then there's this other kind of interesting sort of, it reminds me of Matt Taibbi, I think wrote, I forget what book it was, but he went and spent time with these Tea Party guys in, I think, Westchester County. And when they were talking about their very, very specific small problems, and, not small for them, but stuff that just doesn't, it might cumulatively have an effect on people running small businesses, as an example, but it's certainly not like big frontline important national issues like regulating banks or taming Silicon Valley or reunionizing America, right? But there were a lot of kind of legitimate gripes about how many licensing fees do I have to pay, to process paperwork at the local, whatever, or, different ways that government contracts might be distributed locally in ways that were, crony and favored kind of local political favoritism. Although, ironically, that's another thing that would undermine libertarian arguments because a lot of, smaller scale places have even worse corruption scandals than, national levels. So that's another thing, another kind of libertarian myth about scale that's easily debunked by reality. But the point being that in the United States, you could actually identify a whole set of bureaucratic kind of log jams, some of which might even be legitimately things that are, unfair or unhelpful to people running small scale businesses. And then people took that and it was extrapolated like, see, just as I'm overregulated, so is Jamie Dimon, right? Which is, of course, crazy because obviously, pharma and banks and all these other interests are the ones that run and write the political process. But the point being that maybe in certain parts of business, particularly on a small scale, there actually government could be used in a collaborative way to sort of protect incumbent businesses, which is another thing that libertarians say a lot, although they sort of reverse the order. It's somehow government's fault and not a sort of aggressive monopolistic private sector that has corrupted government. But maybe in Scandinavia, what we're seeing is like, again, and this is what they call with like flexicurity is one of the phrases that come out of the Nordic countries. This idea that on one hand, when it comes to sort of like thinking of a business idea or engaging in the market in a certain way, there should be freedom to challenge monopolies. There shouldn't be lockdowns on opportunities to participate. Obviously, that's ensured through government regulation. A good example here would have been, net neutrality until the Republicans governed that, right? That's a government rule ensuring a certain level playing field in the tech sector to some small extent, which allowed for some small scale and participation in innovation. That type of regulation, which allows markets to genuinely have some competition, which you can't have without government regulation. And then it's coupled with powerful union sector, powerful social sector, and then universal mass distribution through things like robust universal health care, free college, and all sorts of other mass public investments. And of course, just to put on the table here too, very serious environmental regulations, which is another thing that they don't want to contend with either. But does that kind of synthesis actually make sense, right? Like, they could be literally wrong on both accounts. Like, first, totally wrong about the scale of the welfare state and what that means about the nature of government. And of course, their own sort of, own goal with Denmark being the least corrupt. But even in the ways in which these countries actually do ensure that there's a level of kind of small, business innovation and participation, is actually through government sort of enforcing the rules of the road. And there might be opportunity to, in small ways, like help people in, small business sector or whatever. I mean, it's a very abused phrase in the United States, but you get my point.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that all makes sense. I think one thing I'd add is that, I think part of what you're saying is that, we're in a country where one major party has a very strong investment in making the government not work well, mm-hmm. and making your experience with the government bad, and that this is really informed. I mean, it informs how the Republicans, have handled Obamacare, which we've got other problems. We've also got another party that, is so compromised by certain interests that they also inadvertently make interfacing with the government less pleasant than it should be. But you see it with that also with their tax plan. In other countries, the government has enough information on you that it could send you your taxes each year pre-filled out, and you just sign it, make sure there's no errors, and then sign it. And there's been proposals for this, but the combination of, TurboTax and these lobbies for people who help you with your taxes, or I think a genuine Republican investment, and they want you to have a really unpleasant experience filling out your taxes every year, because they want your association with the government to be a burden. And so I think that part of what you're seeing in the Scandinavian countries is if you have a country that actually believes, in the role of government, and all major parties want to actually serve their constituents in the way that they like, you're going to get cleaner government. You're going to get more effective and less, less bureaucratic government, arguably, than what the Republican Party actually wants there to be in the United States.
That's another funny thing, right, is decoupling the idea of bureaucratic nightmares being associated with the public sector. It's so funny to me that it's always, yes, it's the IRS and the DMV. Everybody hates those. Although what's funny, I mean, my IRS agents could actually be quite helpful on the phone, contrary to some of the mythology. But everybody, people don't like those places, and it's pretty obvious why they don't for a variety of reasons. But why isn't there a big cultural myth about, first of all, the obvious thing would be, fighting with your healthcare provider that's literally trying to kill you to increase a profit margin or rob you of care. But even down to the levels that they harp on, you call your, you think you don't have to wait on the phone forever if you call your bank or Verizon. You don't think you aren't dealing with all of the hallmarks of an unaccountable, inhumane bureaucracy. Except in this case, without even the notion that there's some type of public accountability to you. They're just private sector, money funneling machines, just there to decouple you from your bank account as much as possible. That's their sole purpose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think there's some hay that can be made out of that? Hey, you want to talk about big bureaucracies that are unaccountable. Let's talk about the corporations that you interface with and rob you every single day and give you terrible customer service. You think there's some worse?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that some Democrats are starting to do that a little bit. I mean, I think with, both antitrust stuff and also on the idea of funding a public option for the internet, especially for, municipalities in rural areas that don't have access to it, like leveraging the fact that, like, the DMV is unpopular, but I would wager that, like, Comcast and these cable companies are, like, even more, like, these cable monopolies, people hate them. And forcing Republicans, if Democrats can get free enough from the influence of these companies to take advantage of it, forcing Republicans to stand for Comcast against, like, consumers on any issue it seems like a no-brainer as far as the politics of it are concerned.
Yes, I agree with you completely, and I think that we can sort of, and I think that the last thing I want to run by you, I think, look, there was, in some ways, some of it was substantive because it's obviously an important thing to put on the table with regards to talking about the Scandinavian model, to acknowledge the, distinct, obviously, history of white supremacy in the United States and just the complexity of the United States. And I also think, conversely, I say this always, and some people get it or they don't, I'm not a defender of Maduro. There's plenty of self-generated problems and crises generated in Venezuela, but also that's an incredibly disingenuous, comparison to harp on Venezuela, which is a, poorer country, which had, by the way, disparities in an oligarchy before Chavez, which was much more analogous to the United States than something you'd see in the Nordics, and has also been a place that has had endless U.S. interference from intelligence agencies and, natural resource industry. That's a very, I think that we, with regards to Venezuela, without justifying or supporting the Maduro government, also need to do a little bit more pushback on the, like, wow, you mean you're telling me that, a poorer country with distinct problems of corruption and populism in a government of Chavez and Maduro, not having nothing to do with socialism, and with endless U.S. interference and reaction from that country's oligarchy, hasn't produced at the topmost standard. Well, what a shock, right? Like,
yeah.
Okay. And now, by the way, let's go over a list of any number of, far right and fascistic, developing countries, which you support, which have even worse human indicators than Venezuela. So, I think that can be, both complex. Yeah. Go ahead.
I mean, like, by the same token, though, like, I think that's all right, but just in terms of the partisan debate within the U.S., I think those are all also reasons, though, why, like, you want to reject and wipe away the Venezuela thing, because the idea that, like, America's experience with, say, being a country with a state-owned oil enterprise, that would instantly plunge us into conditions analogous to Venezuela rather than analogous to other advanced developed democracies that are very extremely wealthy. Yeah, exactly, like Norway.
Right.
I mean, it's absurd, because what they're doing with that is equating socialism with the disadvantageous conditions that Venezuela is unjustly subject to, but that is just fundamentally irrelevant to the American context.
Not unless Trump has his way for another couple of terms. We could be heading there. We could be like, it's time for nationalization. But it seems to me that there has to be a way of, not always, pointing to the Nordics and not, blindly defending them, but at the same time not overcorrecting. I mean, we can own in the discourse that actually there are countries that have pursued the types of policies that are actually overwhelmingly popular with Americans, that people like Bernie Sanders are advocating. And you know what? They're far from perfect. They have plenty of problems, but they produced an incredible amount of good. And, we can stand on that and fight on that clearly.
Yeah. I think I will say, because something that is happening right now is that there is a far right rising in Sweden for welfare chauvinism, and it is like one of the right's valid arguments, and not actually an argument against the model, but it's just a political argument about whether or not it's basically an argument for why they might be successful in defeating something that most Americans would want, which is that, divide and conquer does kind of work, and resentment of immigrants is a real phenomenon, and that the heterogeneity of American society is a political challenge to, implementing any really just economic system.
Right. That's the challenge and the reality, but not a reason not to, and also not a reason to not point to places that, without glorifying them, and obviously Sweden being the obvious example, with a really deep history in Sweden of some very far right and very racist politics, that still, these places have delivered, and they have produced a lot of gains, and they're no utopia by any stretch of imagination, but there's something to model there.
Right.
Now, speaking of divide and conquer, racism, white supremacy, and just the sort of truly disgusting nature of the United States in 2018, Mr. Burnett, I forget, was it Mark Burnett? Mark Burnett, the producer of The Apprentice.
I think it's Mark.
Mark Burnett has assured Donald Trump that he has never used that word. And by the way, Donald Trump would like you to know that it's a really ugly word, and it's not part of his vocabulary. Omarosa is strongly implying otherwise, and it's been really fun to watch her just continually be as gross as Trump and beat him at his own game, like down to like she says they said something and then they lie about it and then she releases a tape is pretty funny. What do you make of all this? I mean, first of all, I'm assuming you would obviously assume there must be a tape of him saying, I would imagine, all sorts of disgusting things, but also, like what do you think this does to Trump? Like, what is the fallout from this?
Yeah, I don't know. There's so many ridiculous aspects to this. I mean, there's the fact that the Trump administration, like the guy literally, like one of his, like, it could have even been his campaign slogan, like, I hire the best people. And then he spent like his like first like year and a half in office, like just firing one person after another, and then tweeting about what an awful, ridiculous person they are and how they never should have had their job, which is just nuts. Omarosa, to her credit, did, I believe, confirm the long-rumored story that Trump was forcing all government employees, like within the White House, to sign non-disclosure agreements, which is not legal. And so she genuinely like blew a whistle on that, I believe, independent of her other sort of ridiculous or seemingly ridiculous allegations, like that Trump like eats memos.
Does that really sound that ridiculous to you? I believe
maybe
it.
You shouldn't.
I believe it.
But yeah. So, if you look at, I'm sure that Trump has said all kinds of. I don't know if you remember. Do you remember the scandal with Trump's butler in 2016?
Remind us.
Trump's longtime butler at Mar-a-Lago. They discovered he had all these Facebook posts that were just about, going to the White Mosque, as in White House, and like getting that. I forget exactly what he referred to Obama as, but stringing him up on the portico, like lynching Obama.
Wow.
And many other things like that about how we should like kill that Muslim president. And this was his like longtime butler and personal friend. It's really difficult for me. I mean, can you imagine Trump and his butler sitting around the pool and his butler saying something like that, and Trump saying like, "Hey, you shouldn't say that. This country has like a really like scarred history of racism, and it's not okay to joke about lynching Obama. Like, I like you, but you should." I mean, obviously, I don't think that Trump's going to be doing that. So
we have a really destructive history. You should read Notes on Native Son. Notes of a Native Son. Watch Eyes on the Prize. Totally change how you think about that.
Stamped from the beginning.
Real bad stuff. Stamped from the beginning. Amazing book. I mean, IQ test. I mean, it's just pseudoscience to justify oppression. Anyways, we're going to put that she has a different birth date on the call logs, okay? That would actually be a funny character. Like, Trump is himself in every other way. He's just like this horrible human being, but he's just like super like on it when it comes to race.
Yeah, just get structural racism.
No. It's a Facebook post for you, but it's a whole history for them. Yeah. So no, I mean, and I think obviously with his base, it doesn't make. Although I keep getting struck by. Did you watch that CNN focus group? I think it was a week ago, and there was a couple of Trump voters that have flipped on him. And one guy is just this middle-aged white dude, and he just was like, he's racist. And naturally, the woman is like, I forget who. I think it was Allison Camerata. I think that was who was hosting. And she's like, she kept her professionalism, but maybe I'm projecting here. But I do think she was genuinely being like, what makes you say that now? Like, when is this guy not? The guy literally announced his campaign by saying racist stuff about Mexicans. And he just like, well, he called LeBron an idiot. And it's like, well, and I'm whatever. I'm glad that guy's on board now. But that was the thing, was Trump being an asshole to, a guy like LeBron, where you would have to be, if you don't like LeBron, like, what's your problem, right? Like, and so maybe there are a tiny, 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 minuscule handful of people that support Trump, or if they heard him actually saying that would somehow be the water in the face, and they'd wake up about the nature of this guy. But maybe from the perspective of the mainstream press, and I think Sam said this too, if that tape comes out, the sort of playing around, like they still are giving him these like ridiculous, laughable kind of equivalencies and benefit of the doubt, and it will just be out there, and he will have just said that, and then it will be like, we have to just cover it as this guy's a racist buffoon, and maybe that just adds another nail into the coffin of, any bit of sort of credibility or respectability about this guy. I mean, I can't imagine any existing to begin with, but do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it would matter politically. I think that Trump has some soft supporters still, not a lot, but, he has such a low ceiling that he's got to keep everybody he's got on board. And I think that there are, it also depends like when it breaks and how, I don't know. I think that the polls genuinely did move against Trump dramatically after the Access Hollywood thing.
Yep.
And then voters had enough time to like, just forget it. And so if an N-word tape came out, right before the midterms or right before, the 2020 election, I think it would sink him, and maybe it would regardless. It is like kind of like frustrating, obviously. I think it would matter politically because I think that most Americans do understand racism as like this private like thing of like honoring certain like speech and like civil codes,
right,
or whatever. But it is like I just was thinking, with what he's like, if Donald Trump called for banning all Jews from the United States and instructed the Department of Homeland Security to publish each week a weekly list of like crimes committed by Jews, and held like rallies with the mothers of like kids who were murdered by Jews, and like compared them to animals, and then like someone said, hey, there might be a secret tape of him saying kite. I can't imagine caring about that. And I like, his public racism is both enough to very clearly establish that he's a racist personally, and then also is like so much more of a threat to vulnerable minorities in the United States. Like, what matters is what he does in public, not what he says in private. Like, he shouldn't say that in private. Lyndon Johnson shouldn't have like said that in private.
Right,
but, like, at the same time, it didn't matter as much as what he did like with political power.
Well, no, that's that's how totally distorted the conversation, and that's also why, okay, so that's actually a great juxtaposition, right? Like Lyndon Baines Johnson kept up this, horrible rhetoric and probably some really bad personal attitudes in private, and then legislated in a way that was really good. And then, Trump is racist and sexist across the board. And then, like, I don't know, I'm sure, Reagan, he was very classy to, black people in his personal relationships. And maybe he didn't say things. I mean, I'm sure he did say some racist things, but he probably didn't use slurs, and he probably didn't, that type of stuff. Meanwhile, he's waging a war on urban America. He's using white backlash politics every second of the day. Klan memberships are spiking, and he vetoes sanctions against South Africa. So he's, of course, a functionally white supremacy-based president. And I think you're right that the structural problem it points to is the inability to understand racism as a fuller thing, of which obviously not only Trump but all Republican leadership would fit under, and a lot of Democrats. I mean, Bill Clinton, frankly, at some points in his career would absolutely fit my definition. But it does take that, kind of like, well, you can't say that word, and and I also, if you were getting into my comedy lizard brain, I was thinking it would be like a kid who their son was in debt to a Jewish Shylock, right? Trump would be like, Shylock won't forgive the debt. Got to figure out what the hell's going on. But that's perfect, right? Yes, if there were a list of Jewish crimes, Jewish people are animals, Jewish people are banned from the country. I mean, how could there be any question for a second as to what this stuff is? And by the way, absolutely with regards to, Black Americans, but are you kidding? I mean, with Muslims and people from Latin America,
the whole conversation, like, you can't understand American politics if you don't stipulate that it's just genuinely in our culture. Bigotry against Muslims is fundamentally more okay than any other kind of bigotry.
Right.
Otherwise, you can't the White House is staffed by people who came from think tanks that put out reports calling for shutting down 80% of America's mosques. There is no conversation about whether this is an anti-Semitic president. It's those were synagogues. The whole conversation proceeds from the premise that it's fundamentally acceptable to be pretty darn bigoted. But even African Americans have more social capital right now. That you can't. Yeah.
Well, we're working on that. That's for the second term. This is as good a time as any as we head into it. That for all of the many, many problems with Democrats and critiques and needs for street activism, it's time to register. Make sure you vote in these midterms. Eric Levitz, political writer for New York Magazine. I really appreciate your time as always.